We're going to be looking at the topic for this seminar or talks series. In fact, it's not really a seminar series. It's more. Do you want to start rolling, Sadie, on the recording?
Oh, it's recording already. Yeah.
Oh, it's recording. Oh, brilliant. So it's not really a seminar series. It's more of a talks series. And the reason behind that is that we want to make it fairly fluid and fairly discursive, and that probably sounds like a contradiction in terms, because we're using a webinar as opposed to something like a straightforward Zoom or team type meeting. It's partly because we're outward facing. We have to make sure that obviously people's privacy is kept, is sort of protected as well. So the panelists will be on. I think the panelists may sort of not be on in a moment, but in terms of the introduction, it's kind of good for you to be able to see who's going to be presenting over the next 5 weeks, and also it gives them a chance to see, sort of look at the chats and sort of get a sense of each other as well. The panelists had actually met before, because we've obviously been planning this for a while. So do think about that in terms of the sorts of questions that you might have, not just for me, but also for the panelists as well later on. So Photoland is really a space for discussion, and it's about debate, and it's about the sort of dialectics of contemporary photographic practice and research as well. And we tend to use this term Photoland to describe a sort of a sector. It's like a landscape. Often on social media, people will refer to Photoland as being this sort of this area of practice. I think it's also a space of conversations and also contestations at time as well, and differences and tensions, and many of those tensions haven't been resolved, and they're continuing to be there. So really, we wanted to start. I wouldn't use the word interrogating, because I think it's a little bit too harsh, but we wanted to start sort of teasing out some of the potential for those discussions as well. Pretty much all of the panelists are involved in something that, in fact, not even pretty much, all of the panelists are involved in something that you would broadly describe as critical urbanism. We have a sort of a shared interest in that. We're all connected to Goldsmiths, University of London, in some way, shape or form. We've all studied there, we've researched there, and we've spent an awful lot of time wandering around the streets of Deptford and New Cross and London generally. So it's one of the things that sort of unifies us, both in terms of our experiences of studying, researching around urbanism, but also in terms of a sort of an ongoing critical practice as well. And that's a term that urbanists, and visual urbanists in particular, use quite a bit, and you'll see that, this idea of critical urbanism. The series is about the relationship between, autobiography, photography and autobiography. And often we tend to overlook the autobiographical aspects of making images. What does it mean to walk into a street, to walk into a building, to pass through a landscape, to think about our families, think about our personal histories, think about the communities that we're part of or not part of. Sometimes the communities that we work with, sometimes that we collaborate with, and sometimes communities that we pass through. And often we overlook this notion of the autobiographical, what we take to those experiences and those interactions and those entanglements as well. And really this idea developed from that conversation. What do we bring to the act of making, the act of looking, and the acts of research as well. So after having spoken to all of the panelists over many, many years about their practice and stayed in touch with them after they'd been to Goldsmiths and moved on, I really felt that now would be a good opportunity to sort of catch up with people, but also to try to have that ongoing conversation. So before I introduce the panelists, I would like to quickly thank a number of people that have made this possible. Firstly, Goldsmiths, who we're all connected in some way, shape or form to Goldsmiths, for promoting the event as well and supporting it. Also to Open Visor, which is an amazing community arts project that has been a long-term supporter of the work of the Urban Photographers Association, and of course the Urban Photographers Association, my friends and my colleagues there. Also Platform 7, which is an amazing arts project, which in the future we hope to do more work with. I should also thank the speakers themselves, Orly, Mia, Carly, Baz, and of course Mercedes, who is over in the corner there, who is sort of facilitating. She's the host today. She'll be facilitating the sessions over the next few weeks. If you do want to join us for the other sessions, please do. They promise to be really, really interesting talks. I'm very much looking forward to them in terms of seeing, you know, how the projects have moved on. And I should make a quick plug. I know that Bas will be plugging it at the end anyway, because he'll be talking about his book, which is a wonderful book. I know that also Orly has got all sorts of things happening in terms of publishing as well. And I am hoping that we'll be having a conversation about maybe some zines and some other ways of thinking about where these conversations go over the next few weeks as well. Okay, so can I just quickly ask each panelist, each speaker that will be presenting over the next 5 weeks, just to say very briefly what the topic is that they'll be presenting on, maybe a little bit about why they've chosen that particular topic as well. Thank you. So should we start in running order? So if we go for Orly, Mia, and then Carly and Bas.
Right, okay, so good evening. It's great to be here tonight. My name is Orly Zeiler, and I'm an artist. I'm based in Israel right now. And the project that I've been doing in the past nearly 10 years is called Time Elapsed Between Two Frames. And it's a project that I started while I was a student at Goldsmiths College. And it's actually started with a photograph of my family, of my parents, that was taken 10 years before I was born. And I always had this special interest in the family album, my family in particular, and it was a photograph that I carried with me. And I just decided that I wanted to start and have an experiment with that. So my partner and I posed as my parents in this frame, and there was something about it that became very interesting to me. And then it became a whole project with 40 photographs of other people's family albums, and it was done in London, in Israel, and then in Austria. And of course, for me, my personal story, my family album is how everything is related. And I was really interested to check the similarity between my mother and me and my parents, and the idea of the memory that is formed around the family album. So this is what I'm going to talk about.
Hi, my name is Mia, and I'm from Denmark. And I will be giving a talk on the 18th of March about the creative interplay between autobiography and photography and diagnostic imaging, based on a book project that I did with my sister, with my now past sister. And she went to Switzerland 2 years ago and got assisted suicide. Yeah, I'm just going to keep it brief, I think. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Carly. I will be giving a talk on the 25th of March. I'm originally from the US, but I've been living in London for about 2 years now. I did the Goldsmiths program with Paul 2 years ago and developed a project called Emily in Covington, the visual evidence of the transformation of people and place through a situated archive. So that's what I'll be sharing with you. It's kind of like an autoethnography of images found on my iPhone that I had taken in Covington while I lived there for about 4 years, and kind of going back and looking at that narrative and developing research out of those images that already exist. So yeah, I'll be talking on the 25th of March. Thanks.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Bas. I'm from the Netherlands. I'm living in Amsterdam. And yeah, I just published my first book that contains photographs from my photographic projects called Out of Place. I will be talking on the 1st of April about it. And it's about how population density is influencing actually human behavior in very busy places in the world. So I started working in New York, and more cities followed, and I followed now in, like, after 10 years in almost 9 cities. And yeah, it's based on how people move through urban space and how people engage with each other, or maybe not. And it's also very, I think, urgent in this time that we live in now during the COVID times. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And I know Paul as well from the photography and urban cultures course. Is it 5 years ago already? Yeah, yeah, a long time ago. Thank you. Looking forward to it.
Oh, that's great. Well, thanks so much then for the brief introductions to your talks. I'm very, very much looking forward to them. I'll start sharing my talk, which is probably a good thing to do. Let's see if I can go to it now. Share. Okay, is that okay? We'll see that. Sadie, you can see that? Great. Okay. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Fantastic. So let's start then. I will just quickly check the thumbnail videos. That's good. If the panelists want to, you can stay up, or if you want to go off the screen, that's absolutely fine. It's nice for me to see your reactions, your look of surprise and all those things. But if you want to potter off and make a cup of tea or something, so you're welcome to do that. So I'll say a little bit about my background, because obviously this is very much concerned, this project is very much concerned with the relationship between spaces and places, urban spaces, places, and streets, London streets. And I should start by saying that although these images, and I'm going to show you, I'm being very ambitious, I'm going to try and show you 96 images from a much, much larger project. And I will talk about that as well, in terms of what it means to have an archive that is huge, and the management of that archive as well is a big, big challenge. So I'm showing 96 from a much larger body of work. And this body of work is part of a series of bodies of work as well. And I'll say a little bit about that in terms of thinking about how we approach making projects and the sort of change in city and the way we navigate around that city. Now, I started out photographing when I was quite young. I was 14 when I started, and I was at a state school in Greenwich, and I used to spend quite a lot of time wandering around the streets, as a lot of kids in those days did, because London was a much safer place to walk around then. And my father bought me a camera. I started out just in the art department, wandering around the art department, and we had an incredible arts teacher who introduced me to photography, and I got very involved with it very quickly. And my father said, "Would you like a camera for Christmas?" So that's what I got, and that I realised then was a sort of passport really to move around the city, because it meant that I could use my lunch hours at school to wander around. So I'd be given a special pass to leave the school and to actually go into the immediate environments of the school. And that was an amazing thing to actually experience. And as I grew up, I did more and more photography, I did more and more walking. So for me, there was a natural connection between image making and photography as well. And I'll talk again a little bit about that in terms of what it means to walk through urban landscapes, and this idea of a kind of phenomenology of walking, the idea of a kind of an embodied photographer moving through a space. These images are not in the final edit, whatever form that's going to take, but this will be a kind of a working sort of schematic wandering as well. In much the same way as we wander through cities, I'm going to be wandering through the images with you this evening as well. This is an image from Brockwell Park, and I'll be sort of reflecting on some of the images as we wander as well. It's an image from Brockwell Park in Brixton, and I was quite interested in what was happening now. I was at an event there. I was walking around with a very, very small camera. I can't actually see myself for some strange reason, but I know that I'm positioned in roughly the right position. And this is a camera that I or certainly I was working with on this project. It's very simple, like a 35mm camera. I'm not big on kit, frankly. I'm not a kit fetishist, and I'm certainly not a red dot fetishist. I don't have any particular drum to beat around what cameras people use. But I found that a very helpful, a very useful camera, partly because the glass is very good, the optics are very good, and it's very quiet, and it's actually very small to work with as well. And I think sometimes when we talk about photography, we run away, we hide away from a discussion around kit. Sometimes it's seen as being a little bit basic and a bit crude. But I actually think that there is a discussion to be had, especially thinking about, for instance, Carly's work and working with a mobile phone, a camera phone. What does the digital world bring to it? What sort of affordances, as Howard Becker, the sociologist, would say, do we get from actually thinking about and theorizing, researching and making sense of the equipment that we work with? And so I tend not to work with particularly complicated equipment. This is with a 50mm lens. A lot of my work is with 50mm and 35mm. I did start out with other lenses like 28s and 90s. The 90 I never used. None of the images in this is on the 90. A few of them are on the 28. And then I realized that actually just moving in closer it was quite helpful, or just moving back slightly was quite helpful. And of course, the thing about being out in the street is, generally speaking, you have the ability to move backwards and forwards. There's much more potential for movement. So that's Brockwell Park. I was looking at this spinning contraption where people were being spun round. I've never quite fully understood what the attraction is there, but people enjoy it. I was watching these planes going past, and then I realised that there was a point at which the shadow from the spinning contraption, the legs were sticking out, and the shadow was there. But you could just about make sense of this shape of this man, this painted man, on the structure. I didn't know at the time that I would get it absolutely precisely, because you can see his eyes, but also just at that moment, a storm cloud came over, and a plane hit the cloud that was in the background as well. And as someone that's working in a sociological environment, that's my day job. I'm interested in this in terms of these notions of the rhythm. And the idea, as Henri Lefebvre describes and discusses, this idea of a rhythm analysis. And I think that a lot of what we do in terms of street-based work is really concerned with trying to understand and make sense of the rhythms of things in front of us. And of course, that involves an awful lot of waiting, of active looking, of trying to make sense of the landscape, whether it's urban or rural, in front of us, and trying to think about how things connect up. And I think that, classically speaking, art historians talk about elements within the frame. When you look at a painting or an element, within the kind of composition and the way in which those different elements speak to each other. And of course, the thing about painters is that they're actively involved in constructing an image. They're thinking very carefully. They're spending a lot of time thinking about all these compositional elements coming together. But I would say it's something that is a misunderstanding in terms of photographic practice, because we don't really talk that much about just how much construction goes into the process of making an image. And this idea of how an image materializes, I think, is very much part of the process of thinking about street-based work. I did say that I don't describe myself as a street photographer per se. I prefer to use the term urban photographer because I am an urbanist by training. and by inclination. But I'm an urban photographer that spends an awful lot of time in the street. And I think that really when we look at urban photography, it's a very, very broad range of practices, many of which speak to each other. So many urban photographers are involved in portraiture or in architectural work or in landscape work, or maybe, you know, more fine art sort of conceptual work or fine art documentary work, or all sorts of other kinds of genre crossover. Should we call it genre crossover? And I think for many urban photographers, they're actually less concerned with the exactitude of genre definitions, the containment of genre definition, being sort of locked into a set of definitions that are often not very helpful, and often don't actually tell us very much about the range of practices. I should note, I think things have shifted in street photography over the last 5 years, 10 years. I think there was a point at which there were what we might describe as a sort of definitional thought police were out and about, sort of, you know, patrolling the streets and saying, oh, no, 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 that's not real street photography. Street photography is this. And all sorts of people were setting themselves up as being the primary definers of street photography. I would say that that has started to become a lot more fluid, and a lot more other forms are now being seen as being relevant to that practice as well. Now, I did say that I'd talk a little bit about part of my background, and I grew up in Greenwich, as I said. I went into, after I left school, I went into youth and community work for a bit. I worked for a little bit of time for the probation services in Greenwich as well. And while I was there, I got a chance to, I was what was called a recreational supervisor while I was studying actually as well, which was a part-time job, and it meant I was working with young offenders and people that have been given court orders where they had to do community service. And that was an amazing set of experiences. And from that, I then landed up going into education-based work. So I became a community education worker and then specialised in adult education. I spent a lot of time setting up things like Saturday schools and things like this as well. And it had a very, very important impact on me, because it made me think about the relationship between making images and sort of social justice. Where does art come from? What does it speak to? How do people get involved in these practices as well? Now, I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to go backwards and forwards between some of my autobiographical recollections and some of the images as well, because the whole point of this for me is that when I look into the images, I see aspects of who I am as well, and aspects sometimes of my childhood. The previous image, the man that's got his hand, the elderly man that's got his hand on what I take to be his son's shoulder, and sort of he's stopped, the boy has stopped, he's noticed me, and his son is holding him. I don't know what is he holding him to take him back? Is he holding him to get him to stop? Is he holding him because he's not very steady on his feet? It's difficult to know, but there's a sign above, and there's a connection there. And I think that this is what a lot of street-based work is really concerned with, is this notion of how things connect. And often they connect and they interconnect in ways not necessarily clear at the time. When I made this photograph, this was outside the British Museum many, many years ago. It was only later, when I was printing the image, that I really noticed the puddle of water right at the base of the sculpture, just by the sculpture's mouth. And it had been raining and the rain had come down. Now, I don't know if the artists who made the mask, who set it, had designed that, if that was something that was intentional, or if it was something that was almost coincidental and accidental as well. I don't know. And this is the challenge, isn't it? That often there are things that we don't really understand, we can't fully understand, and sometimes we don't see them until we step back. In this case, I didn't even notice that for some considerable number of years, and it was when I was really looking at it closely I realized that there was a connection there. Also, this issue about gesture seems to be something that comes through in the photographs as well. I realized that a lot of the images have people touching objects, looking out of the frame, looking at things that are going on outside of the frame as well. Sometimes people do things that they probably shouldn't be doing. This is a man that was sat on top of a public telephone box. You don't get them designed like that any longer. And I think it might have something to do with the fact that people like sitting on them and using them as sort of individual sofas. You know, this is at Notting Hill, going back many years ago, and this would have been in the late 90s. But I was really interested in how this man was drinking his bottle of wine and how people were looking back at me. I have no problem with people looking at me while I'm photographing. I do work with much bigger cameras, medium format cameras now, where unlike with the Leica, with a small 35mm rangefinder camera, you can be seen from a long distance away. There is this idea, isn't there, within more classical street photography that, you know, if people are actually acknowledging your presence, then in some way that takes away some of the authenticity. I mean, I've seen those arguments made, I've heard those arguments made that, you know, in true observational modality, you know, you should be this sort of silent, you know, external ghost-like witness who shouldn't be seen in the process. So, and they shouldn't be acknowledged in the process. And of course, there's people that are involved in ethnography, social research, know that that's actually something of a misunderstanding, or maybe it's not a misunderstanding, it's an interpretation of a particular form of practice that many critical urbanists are not really that concerned to reflect in their work. And I should say that that's where I went after that. After I'd been working in youth and community work and probation work and community education work, I found myself asking questions. Photography brought me to study sociology and law. My undergrad was socio-legal studies. And it was an amazing experience, actually. It was something really else, because I got to really think about human rights, social justice, social policy in particular. I spent a lot of time thinking and researching these topics. So I was still going out photographing and thinking about these things as well. The issue was that the more I studied things like sociology and law, the more I slid off into other areas. I started sliding off into psychology. I then did a postgrad in social research methods at Middlesex. And then I thought, you know what? I'm really interested in ethnography. I better really go on and do some studies in anthropology. So I went back to Goldsmiths and then did a master's in anthropology. How does this relate to the photograph? Well, when I look at these images, this idea of kind of contested space, these ideas of a kind of an anthropological geography start to appear, and I start to be having conversations with people in the street. Now, when I made this photograph in the middle to late 90s, it was actually quite difficult for people to photograph in civil disturbance environments. If you had a camera, you were as likely to find yourself on the wrong side of people that were doing the civil disturbance, the uncivil or the civil, the disturbances, as you were by the police as well. And things have changed in that respect now. And that's partly to do with the ubiquity of digital media, of social media and camera phones. If you go to a public event, if you go to, I was out doing some work on the Black Lives Matter movement last summer, and everyone seemed to have cameras. I mean, they had cameras, digital cameras, they had mobile phones and they were working with that. When I was doing this in the early days, when I was photographing disturbances like this, I hesitate to use the term riots, but where things really did sometimes kick off, very few photographers were there. There'd be press photographers, but people weren't, as a matter of course, carrying cameras with them. Much of the project is really about disappearances as well, in terms of people that sort of just disappear into space. I went through a period where I got quite interested in London's alleys, and spent quite a bit of time just hanging around, just seeing what would happen if anything happened at all. And I also realized that there's a kind of an interplay between verticality and the kind of horizontal as well. Much of what I do in terms of working with the larger format cameras now involves working horizontally, but actually working with a kind of vertical play as well brings something different to the projects as well. I haven't ordered these. I thought to order these in terms of space, to edit them in space. And I realized the more I tried to do it, I was forcing an edit onto the photographs that didn't work for me. It doesn't work for the way in which the images speak to each other. And I realized that what it was is that I was over-rationalizing and I was over-projecting this idea of a kind of a sort of spatial uniformity onto the work. So the edit that you'll see now, which is work in progress, reflects what I think will be the final outcome, whatever that outcome is going to be. So I think there'll be iterations and reiterations in much the same way as music works. What I didn't mention was that when I was young, when I wasn't hanging around in the art department, I was also a music scholar. So I was doing classical guitar, and I trained as a classical singer as well. I had what was then the Inner London Educational Authority singing scholarship. So I spent a lot of time doing music. I was probably practicing about 3 hours a day, something like that. I think there's no question about it, that it influences the way in which I think about film and the way in which I think about making images as well. I was interested in the relationship between these two young women and the pigeons that you don't really see very much now at all because they've been banned and they've been cancelled. From time to time you get hawks. There are professional hawk flyers that come into Trafalgar Square and fly the hawks around, and the pigeons leave pretty fast, So they've been banned, and that means effectively I wouldn't be able to get an image like this now. But really, for me, the interplay is between the image on the bag of the man on the right and the two women as well. And sometimes when you're making images, you realize that there are elements, again, as I said earlier, that speak to each other. And of course, the people that are in that frame, that are looking back at us, are not necessarily aware of that, but we're aware of those images. And that's what I mean, and that's what an awful lot of sociological and anthropological and geographic thinkers mean when they talk about the images constructed as well. It isn't just found, it's actively constructed. Trafalgar Square, on the left, a political refugee would turn up and he would paint, he would draw. You won't see that now because not only have the pigeons been banned, but also the vendors have been banned from the space. And his daughter would hang upside down. I was at St Martin's at the time. I went back and did a film course there. You probably get a sense, I've spent quite a lot of time studying stuff. And it's partly because I'm what you would describe as an interdisciplinary urbanist. So I've been able to actually go back to do things, to study, in art departments and in anthropology and sociology and archaeology departments as well. And so I was at St Martin's. I used to wander down to Trafalgar Square during the lunch times. This is back 25 years ago. And I realized that every time I went there, this young child, was virtually always seeming to go through a ritual of sort of hanging upside down and looking at the world upside down. And I got to know her father, who was the artist on the commercial street artist on the left. And he told me a little bit about his story. And he was a political refugee that found himself in Europe, come to Europe, and then landed up in London. Again, it was one of those strange things where it was many years later when I was blowing up the image that I looked at the writing on the bag, and it was a dictionary definition of the word of art. And it really struck me as being interesting that the child would see the world, would look at the world differently from that of an adult. And that next to her was a definition of art, which was about seeing and about seeing the world in an expanded manner. Now, what I'm going to do in order to be able to get through these images, I'm going to show you the images, some of them, and I might stop and sort of reflect on them. And some of them I'll show you with a degree of silence. I do work in colour mainly now. I very rarely work in black and white. And I do see this image, every time I see this, I still think of the colour side of it. I remember the bright pink and lime green and yellow of the ice cream that the woman had. And although the strip in the middle of her coat appears to be white, it was actually a kind of a very subtle yellow. I still remember that. I remember the blue sky and the green. But it works for me because I was working in black and white at the time as a translation. And I'd like to say this, I've said it before, but I'll say it again. When you read, when people say that you know, black and white is the easy version of photography, I think that's a highly contentious statement to make. I think it's deeply problematic, and I think it suggests a lack of understanding of practice. It might well be an opinion, it might be a view, but as someone that works extensively in colour, I can say this very clearly, that working in black and white for me is harder because it's translation, because you have to take to it an understanding of what's actually happening to tones. It doesn't mean that in colour you're closer to the thing itself, you're closer to reality as is often claimed. It just means that black and white is a different level of translation. Sometimes stuff happens that you can't anticipate. So I was out photographing in Deptford, and this machine, this was called the Deptford Crusher, blew up 2 days after I'd photographed it, because somehow there was some sort of compressed gas canister in one of the cars that was being crushed, or one of the objects that was being crushed. I remember I was living in Deptford at the time, and I remember hearing this almighty bang and thinking, I wonder what that is. I just thought there was an accident. And it was when I went back to photograph it some days later, the site manager told me, well, you can't because it's no longer there. It was just blown to smithereens. Stuff changes, things change. This is the Deptford anchor. I was there not so long ago, and this anchor was removed, partly because people were out drinking on it. This was Deptford High Street on a Saturday morning, very busy. And the way in which the anchor was set up, it was on a plinth, and people would sit on the plinth, and some people come down and bring a can of special brew or tenants with them and have a fag and have a nice morning out, you know. And I was living in Deptford at the time, so this would have been in the mid-90s, mid-90s at the time. And people got to sort of see me out and about with the camera, so people sort of knew who I was. And I think that's, again, a very important thing to say. You know, what sort of, or to think about, you know, what sort of contact do you have with people? How do you explain being in that particular space? I grew up in Greenwich, just up the road. So I felt that I could have those, I didn't just feel, I used to have conversations with people about the area in terms of my own autobiographical connection. The Royal College of Psychiatrists. A trainee psychiatrist may be looking at people going past on the train. They're blurred. A woman leaving the British Museum with a cigarette. Again, cigarettes are banned. There's an awful lot of things that are banned now around London. So you wouldn't really be seeing people doing that. But I was interested in the connection between the shape of the cigarette and the Doric columns behind her. An image I can't quite make sense of. It looks like a man who's actually about to prod the man in front of him with a stick. Actually, it's not. It's a man with a rolled up poster who was just walking past and doing that on his hand, but just happened to come into that space. But he didn't just happen to come into that space, because I'd seen the background beforehand. I couldn't possibly have anticipated that a man just the right size would walk into that space, so his face would be delineated, or that his stick, his poster, his rolled up poster, would fit just between the 12 and the 13, just at that point. I couldn't imagine any of that. But I think that what happens sometimes is that we train our brains to see things and to respond to things. Mercedes, who's organising this, will know all about this. She's a fencer. So the idea of being able to see things that the brain, that the eye, you'd imagine, couldn't actually see, I think is something that resonates with street-based, maybe with all forms of photography, really, because we have to train ourselves to imagine and to anticipate things. I was asked to make this image by their parents, partly because I've been out and about photographing, and one of the parents came up to me and said, "Oh, we've seen you, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing a project." I was at Goldsmiths as a fellow at the time, as a research fellow, and I was out and about filming and photographing. And she came over and said, "We've been watching you photographing. Are you going to photograph our kids?" And I said, "Oh, if you want me to." She said, "Oh, yeah, we'd like you to." So I did. And that was actually a very important moment for me in terms of really reinforcing this idea of how do we explain our presence in space. I came into that space with a kind of an explanatory framework of what I was doing, why I was there, rather than just having a conversation about my rights as a photographer. And I think that a lot of street-based work, street photography, really struggles with that in terms of thinking about not just the kind of explanatory frameworks, but the rights that people actually have to know what you're doing. Because I think there are times, especially when you're photographing children, you're photographing people that are vulnerable, there are times, I think, where you do need to be able to say what you're doing and why you're doing it as well. When it comes to the discussion, Q&A, people may have other views on that. I'd certainly be very interested to hear what the views are. A lot of what I'm doing is also about light and shade, and about things, again, that I haven't anticipated that happen to disrupt those compositions as well. I made quite a few images from Brick Lane and the surrounding areas well, in fact, I started in 1986. I started photographing there when I was at LCC doing photojournalism. It just became a series of walks. I did actually land up working in the sociology department just around the corner, where I was researching the impact of the 1989 Children Act. So I was actually a working sociological researcher. And again, during my lunch hour, I used to disappear with my Leica and walk around the area as well. I got to know a whole bunch of people, local families as well. And there'll be people that I recognised on the street, and they would recognise me as well. I was quite interested in this juxtaposition between Rembrandt looking back through the mists of time and this young local boy standing there with the wheel that he's just bought and the cans of paint that he's just bought. Maybe he's going to, I don't know, maybe he's going to spray a bike, or maybe he's going to go out and do some graffiti art, who knows. But also the other two men who are standing looking, we don't know really what they're looking at. So a lot of my images are actually concerned with acts of looking, people looking at me, or looking at each other, or looking out of the frame, possibly looking at people looking at them. And I spent some time photographing right at the end, in the middle of the 90s and towards the end of the 90s, some of the issues around the neo-Nazi presence there as well. And it was very difficult. I got very caught up in some of the violence there. It's a conversation that at some point I'll have elsewhere. But it's difficult to imagine neo-Nazis standing on the street corner hurling abuse at people of colour every Sunday, mob-handed, lots of people there. And eventually, as the area changed, it became more and more difficult for them to do that, because there would, of course, be regular punch-ups. And again, in terms of thinking about what we bring to that, in terms of the autobiographical aspect, you know, I'm a person of colour who grew up in Greenwich, experiencing what that actually meant. I was a very close neighbour of the Lawrences and photographed at their funeral, and made the first Channel 4 film about the murder of Stephen Lawrence and the inability of the Metropolitan Police to take the investigation seriously. So for me, when I was out there photographing anything that related to the far right, it kind of was personal, but it was also deeply autobiographical as well. And I should say, as an aside, one of the strange aspects of this is I saw the man who's looking into my lens about an hour later, and he was standing outside the Brick Lane bagel shop, eating a bagel. And for those of you who know about the history of the East End, you'll know that that was a traditional Jewish, sort of snack, lunch. And I just thought that was a very interesting moment where you had someone who was a member of a far-right organisation that was involved in violence against people of colour, who was very clearly part of a sort of anti-Semitic bloc as well, was standing outside a bagel shop eating something that was associated with it, the historic presence of Jewish people in the area as well. And I think sometimes these relationships are very complex and very nuanced and very, is that word again, entangled as well. And part of our role is to try to unpack some of those complexities as well. Grandmother sitting there making a daisy chain with her grandson. Boy sitting outside a fish and chip shop, again looking at just looking at the world going by. There are quite a few images of people just looking back at me. These are nuns returning to their convent. They live just opposite where I live in Clapham. So I used to see them quite a bit. And there was just that moment where she just looked directly into the camera. Yeah. But what I was interested in was the sign above, sticking to what we know best. Death walking through Trafalgar Square. A pigeon, a shadow maybe, alighting from the shoulder. In the foreground, there's a man sleeping. And so this becomes, for me, a kind of reflection on the dream state of the streets as well. This notion of oblivion. This is from a fairground ride. Spent a lot of time waiting for everything to light up in the right order. I do a lot of work around shadows and people passing through shadows. It's just by the Jubilee line extension, and the trees were casting these shadows in the winter as well. A couple embracing on the tube. It's interesting actually, because they knew I was there. I actually made this with a 35mm lens, and I think they were just so just absorbed with each other. She looked up and saw me photographed and smiled and just went back to hugging her partner. So I thought, okay, there you go. And sometimes we have those conversations, don't we, about what permission looks like. Sometimes it's a smile, sometimes it's gestural. I think sociology and the social sciences struggle with that. We can't run around with a clipboard asking for people to sign release forms all the time. I know there are certain agencies that would love us to do that, but in reality, that's not how it works. I still can't quite work out what this cabbie was doing asleep in his cab on a double yellow line. But anyway, there he was asleep in his cab on a double yellow line in central London. And I was interested in the relationship clearly between the figure of the woman sleeping and the man as well. So people sleeping became a little bit of a project for me. This is at Princess Diana's funeral, and there was all this mayhem going on in the background, like hundreds and hundreds of journalists and film crews and all sorts of people. And there was a television technician who just managed to, he'd come prepared. He came with a pillow and a book, and the book was just the right thickness to elevate his head to the right position so that he could sleep. And he slept, and I walked past and he was asleep. I walked past about 10 minutes later and he was still asleep amongst all of this cacophony of sound. That takes practice and it takes dedication. Back to Deptford. So I did quite a bit of work on carnivals and young people in carnival spaces. This is a group of young Caribbean women who were practicing for the upcoming Deptford Carnival. Right at the beginning, when I lived in Chelsea, of a man who walked past. I was actually photographing the shop window there as a wedding outfitters, and he walked past, stopped in front of me, adjusted his jacket, looked into the camera, waited until I'd photographed him, and then just walked off, just smiled and walked off. And I remember thinking that was a really interesting moment for me, just the idea of people just insisting that they should be photographed, and how do we as street-based photographers or street photographers, how do people actually respond to that? I spent some time at Speaker's Corner, and this is a woman. There was a particular moment where the wind would catch the leaflet, and I noticed that underneath the leaflet it said hell, and I was interested in that, in terms of, so I spent quite a bit of time waiting for the wind to catch that so I could see that part as well. Christian atheism, I still haven't worked out what that is. Only if God dies can Jesus live. And the man who's standing there looking back at me, it's interesting, just because he was clearly thinking, again, he was used to me being there, because I went there for several years photographing, probably every other Sunday for about 3 years. When you look at this image, you see one tower. So the landscape is changing. This is from in the early 90s. In fact, this would be 1990, right at the beginning of 1990. It's odd because it was only when I was doing the scanning at the University of West London, when I gave my little spiel about thanks, I forgot to mention, not that I forgot, but I should make a big mention of the University of London, who brought me in as a visiting fellow, visiting artist, and gave me unfettered access to their fantastic darkroom and their scanning facilities as well. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. But it's when I was doing these scans, I then noticed that there was the single tower and how things had changed. I did at one point think about putting them together, and it doesn't work because it's too literal. So you can see from this that you get a sense of moving through these different spaces back to the East End. And at some point, we do come across the building of Canary Wharf as well, which I saw. The image that you'll see at some point is from about 7-8 years later, and suddenly the tower is no longer a single tower. We don't see it now, but there was a period where Reclaim the Street, which was an anarchist direct sort of action group, were out and about on the streets. And this is in the City of London. Again, the sort of style of policing, the way in which it's dealt with, is fundamentally different. Is Britain rotten to the core, the man asks, as the man behind him sleeps, and the statue of George Washington looks out over Trafalgar Square. It's a wedding, people on their way to a wedding. London Zoo, penguins no longer live there. I spent some time photographing shop windows and the displays that people had as well. Oh, back to the East End again. There's a number of stores which used to sell cameras. This is from Charlie and Louise, who are in Deptford, taking their pet dog down to the vets. Charlie, I knew from one of the estates that I'd worked on where I was teaching photography, and his daughter Louise. Louise used to like walking around without shoes on, so there she was, walking through Deptford with a pet duck on the way to the vets. And you can see the buildings are now going up, and this is from the the sort of 1997-ish, and from the Docklands Light Railway. Going back to people sleeping, this man with his thumb in the book at the point where it needs to be. There are quite a few cats that seem to keep cropping up in the images. And this particular cat was just staring at me. And I loved the position of the cat in relation to the car, but also the intensity of the gaze. So this idea of people that gaze back, people that gaze into spaces as well. If you go to the South Bank now, this is absolutely packed out. Well, it's not now, of course, during COVID, but in normal times, it's packed out with books. This is right at the beginning of the book fair that they have there as a full-time feature of the space now. But then you just had like one trestle table. And I love the way in which the light caught the books as well. From Soho, it's obscene. I won't go into this because we don't have time, but this is from one of the first riots I photographed. And this was a point at which I realized I wasn't really a photojournalist because I wanted to stay and see what happened when all of the other photographers left. And they did leave, and the style of policing completely changed once they'd left. I'm going to finish with just these images, which are from the East End, from Greenwich, from Thamesmead, and these images were made during a very difficult period for the local community there, where a number of young black men were murdered by people that were, if not directly associated, arguably influenced by the rise of the far right, the presence of the British National Party. So from Stephen Lawrence's, and this is from Roland Adams' memorial service as well. And this was just literally up the road from where I lived. It was a very difficult period in terms of thinking about the sort of changes that we'd seen taking place.